Yes, good morning, good morning, good morning. Hello, AP Euro. Back to work today. Let's see, announcements. I looked at, a lot of the test results, and, there were varying grades. I do want to, of course, my goal is for us on Friday to finish up with the test on this unit, which I am currently working on and about 2/3 of the way completed with. It will be like the one you took yesterday with the matching terms and a heavy dose of the take-home test. That will get us off clean so that when we return from spring break on April the 14th, is that right? Yeah, April 14th, the day after Easter, that we will start talking about reviewing for the AP exam. Friday, April the 3rd, of course, is another day. Excuse me, I'm sorry, I forgot to turn off the television.
So this really lines up with the storm hazards we're looking at today. Damaging winds, hail, tornadoes possible. So
yes. By the way, do you like the quilt and the pillows? My wife made those. She got into quilting last year, and my wife's very creative. But anyway, yeah, we want to start off clean. Please feel free to comment on the quilt. It's purple and orange. It's two of her favorite colors, Clemson. But anyway, we want to start off clean. A big day will be Friday, because the College Board promises they're going to tell us the exact who, what, when, where, and why of this year's AP exam. What we know about that exam now, it will not be multiple choice, even though when we review, we're going to utilize multiple choice questions, because the test will be either SAQ or LEQ, and therefore it's based on what you know. And so if you can answer, multiple choice questions, then, you stand a pretty good chance. Well, it helps you, to be able to pull information out of your head. And so, yeah. So Friday is a big day, the test, and of course the finding out finally about this AP exam. Next week, I intend to leave you alone for the most part, although since we can't go anywhere, what difference does it make? Although I'm sure that you guys would like to play Fortnite. Forever and ever. Now, also yesterday, I was watching a documentary when I was working. I multitask a lot. And so when I'm here working on a test, I had DVR'd a thing that was on the History Channel. Can you believe the History Channel actually had something about history? Yeah, right. And so they were rebroadcasting this thing they did in 2014, I think it was, called The Two World Wars. And there were two segments. Each one was 4 hours long. Of course, that includes commercials. But, they were fairly well done, and they talked a lot about the period that we're on now, the period between the wars. And I always find something new every time I watch these things. For example, I was unaware of the fact that when Adolf Hitler and Mussolini first began communicating, that the relationship between the two was very much Mussolini here, Adolf Hitler here. Mussolini the teacher, Adolf Hitler the student. Because Mussolini, of course, had acceded to power, pardon me, had acceded to power much earlier than, well, not a few years earlier than Adolf Hitler had. Pardon me. But of course, in the end, basically, Hitler had to save Mussolini's bacon militarily on more than one occasion. Greece, the Balkan Peninsula, North Africa. Adolf Hitler really, I don't think he had any real immediate interest in North Africa. And by the way, what that film doesn't tell you, but that I did know, that because Adolf Hitler bailed out Mussolini in the Balkan Peninsula, it set back his timetable to invade Russia a total of 6 weeks. That was very, very, very important, because those 6 weeks puts the German army deep in Russia in the winter. And had it been 6 weeks earlier, who knows? Because the German war machine was utilized a lot of diesel machinery, and they were in their summer equipment. And, when the bitter Russian winter came, it was just, well, another story. And so, yeah. But yeah, I watched that. The History Channel is also, they say, coming soon, a story about a 3-part documentary on the life of Ulysses S. Grant. Why Ulysses S. Grant? He was of course, the general who seemed to snatch victory out of the jaws of defeat for the Union in the Civil War. And then he turns around and becomes one of the worst presidents this country's ever known. Why? Because he was never presidential material. He worked in his father-in-law's store in Ohio. Yeah. Somewhere up there before the Civil War. That's worthwhile. So let's get to it, and let's start talking about this unit so we can finish it. But it's always good to see you all, even if I don't see you. Yeah, it's good to be back with you. So let us begin, shall we? So we are talking now about this thing called the Successor States, which is a term, that'll be on your test, which is a term that applied to the newly created countries, the ones I've been telling you about all year: Czechoslovakia, the Czech Republic and Slovakia, Poland, Hungary, that were created by dividing up the Austrian, Russian, and German empires after World War I. And so they were called the Successor States. Once again, many of these states were built simply to provide a buffer zone against not Nazism, communism. Your study guide there says Bolshevism. Yeah, the same thing, communism. The Russians, because once again, in the 1920s, the Nazi party was this little bunch of kooks in Germany led by this guy we'll talk about more later, who actually copied his mannerisms for speaking. I'm talking about Hitler now, who copied his mannerisms for speaking from a stand-up comedian in Munich. That just told me I'm live on YouTube. But anyway, yes, from a stand-up comedian in Munich. And so no one was really, in the 20s, no one thought a whole lot about the Nazis. They were just these bunch of crazies. But we'll talk about them later. But what everybody was worried about on both sides of the Atlantic was Russian communism. Remember once again that as soon as World War I was over with, Britain, France, the United States and Germany all sent contingents of soldiers into Russia to put down the communist movement. They failed. So everybody was afraid of Bolshevism. So getting back to the matter at hand, the part B, these new states, the successor states, had no history of parliamentary government and were unprepared to rule themselves. I mean, it's great to want to rule yourselves, but they had no history at all of parliamentary government. This is, the United States in its inception was different because, for example, and I'm talking American history, all 13 of the colonies, who later became the first 13 states, all of them had legislatures that were elected officials. They were trained in parliamentary procedure, and so the transition from being a colony of Great Britain in 1776 to an independent country in 1787 was nowhere near as shocking. Also, it was a great aid to the United States, and I'm off the subject here, forgive me. It was a great aid to the United States that between the new fledgling country of the 13 colonies, the so-called United States, and the meddlers in Europe, particularly the British, there was this little thing called the Atlantic Ocean, which even then on the fastest ships took 3 weeks to cross, on the fastest ships. But the new states created after World War I didn't have either of those advantages. They didn't have a history of parliamentary government, and so that gives rise to radicalisms, extremisms, and also they were living right next door to their potential enemies. And I don't mean just the bigger countries. I also mean the other countries, the other, the Czechoslovakia were wary of the Hungarians. They were all wary of the Hungarians, the Poles, none of these new states were financially stable, with the possible exception of Czechoslovakia. In other words, they had no way to put tax dollars into the government treasuries. The rest of the states will be hard hit by the Depression when it shows up, as they were primarily agricultural. These states were often troubled by ethnic differences between them. For example, in Czechoslovakia, it's not like there were just Czechs or just Slovaks. There was a significantly large, minority of Germans who lived in Czechoslovakia, not to mention Jews and the Roma, the Gypsies. There were lots of small ethnicities that lived in these newly independent states that, once again, you have a case where these newly independent states who had longed so long for independence, for freedom, as soon as they got independence and freedom, turned right around and put the thumb screws to the minorities living within their borders. And so, these states were often beset by ethnic differences within them, as states were not built along ethnic lines, you see. Poland went from being a democracy to being victim of a coup in 1926 by General of the Army Marshal Joseph Pilsudski. Czechoslovakia, who had cooperated with the Allies in World War I, did form a democratic government. But once again, the Germans living in the Sudetenland, please tell me you remember what the Sudetenland, in case it crops up on your test. The Sudetenland is a region in far western Czechoslovakia, and it was populated predominantly by Germans. And later on, when our good friend Adolf Hitler comes to power, it will be one of the first things he says, I want that back. If this stupid virus hadn't have hit, one day after May the 6th, we'd have been watching Schindler's List. Oskar Schindler, the primary character of Schindler's List, was from the Sudetenland. Right now, I can't remember the town he lived in. I'll remember it later on. So Hungary was now divided from Austria, but also faced turmoil. Bela Kun, a communist, ruled for a while, but he was defeated by a Romanian army who were sent in to destroy the communist threat. Once again, communism. It was all about communism. Admiral Miklos Horthy then became regent. Kun had been murdered by Stalin's thugs as he cooperated too much with the socialists. A cardinal sin as far as the communists went. Yeah. Cooperating with these liberal socialists was a major no-no. During the 1920s, Count Stephen Bethlen and General Julius Gombos came to power. They were both anti-Semitic and they ran rigged election. Anti-Semitism became a staple of Hungarian politics, and that is why after World War II in Hungary, after World War II in Hungary, there will be about 3,000 Jews left in the entire country. And Hungary once had a tremendously large Jewish population. But yeah, so Austria, which was now, Austria was just little tiny Austria, basically the same size it is today. Austria tried to resist Nazi infiltrators, but was unsuccessful. One of the terms, yes, is called der Anschluss. You see that there in your study guide? Der Anschluss. You say, what does that mean? In 1938, Germany, remember, Adolf Hitler technically was not German. Technically. He was Austrian. Oh yeah, all Austrians are German, but not all Germans are Austrian. But okay, so he was Austrian. And in 1938, Adolf Hitler and his Nazi collaborators annexed. That means they added Austria to Germany. And that was called der Anschluss, the annexation. Engelbert Dollfuss became the chancellor of Austria. Dollfuss outlawed every party except for the Christian Socialists, the agrarians, the paramilitarists, who composed what was called the Fatherland Front. Yeah, obviously a very right-wing association, very conservative association. He was shot during a Nazi coup. The coup was unsuccessful, but he got killed. In Yugoslavia, the Corfu Agreement, and I just saw you, Miss Manning, you circled the Corfu Agreement because you know that it might pop up on your test. The Corfu Agreement had established a country that was dominated by Serbs who fought the Roman Catholic Church Croats. As Miss Basinich can tell you, the animosity in what used to be Yugoslavia, did not begin in 1984. It only flared up again in 1984. No. The animosity between the Serbs, who are Slavs and who are Eastern Orthodox Christians, versus the Croats from Croatia, who are Roman Catholic Christians, and then, of course, the Bosnian Muslims, who are leftovers of the dominance of and forgive me for using the word leftovers, but who were left over from the dominance of the Ottoman Empire. That animosity had lasted for a long time. It goes far back. It goes centuries back to a period of time when, that region of the world, the Balkan Peninsula, what was then Yugoslavia, at one point in time was dominated first by the Roman Empire, the Roman Catholic Church, then by the Ottoman Empire, the Bosnian Muslims, then later, of course, by the Austrian Empire. And so, yeah, at each time a different power took over, at least two of the three ethnic groups had the thumbscrews put to them. because they were part of an unpopular minority. The point of the matter is, you say, what are you talking, Mr. Horton, you're rambling. I don't get it. Simple fact of the matter. Serbs, Croats, Bosnian Muslims had been fighting with each other for centuries. There it is. I mean, if you fast forward a little bit to World War II, the Serbs, of course, took up the part of the Allies, the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union. Why? Because they were Soviet. The Croats fought with the Nazis. Why? Because they liked the Nazis, not particularly, because the Nazis, I mean, that would make them fight against the Serbs. They hated the Serbs more than they hated the Nazis. Anyway, so the Corfu Agreement, establishing Yugoslavia, led to a dictatorship under King Alexander I, who was a Serb, and he outlawed political parties and was assassinated. In most of the successor states, one authoritarian government had been replaced by another. Okay. And I mentioned this before, you know, it's the economy, stupid. Now, this is me talking, but it's worth noting it's the economy, stupid. One of the problems created in these new countries that were created out of the old Austrian Empire was that, you know, they established these artificial borders, these new borders that prevented goods from easily moving from one country to another. I mean, and so that means they had to pay tariffs. Bottom line is it hampered the economy of these newly created countries, just at a time when these countries needed money. And so, yeah. All right. Now let's talk about Germany. You know, a lot of people get into history because they are fascinated with studies of Nazi Germany and the rise of Nazism and things like that, I suppose. But anyway, right after World War I, Germany for the next 14 years or so is ruled by this thing called the Weimar Republic. The Weimar Republic was the so-called democratic / parliamentary representative government that ruled Germany basically from 1919 to 1933, 34, 35, you know, when Adolf Hitler came in and said, we're changing stuff. So, part A, the Social Democrats, who was one of the parties, and the Weimar Republic were always associated with defeatism of the Versailles Treaty, which they had to accept or to be invaded. You see, so remember, it was the Weimar Republic that signed the Treaty of Versailles, the Weimar Republic that basically surrendered, and you know, now I'm looking at it through the eyes of Adolf Hitler, surrendered to the Allies, even though not one foreign boot stood anywhere in Germany. And in fact, German soldiers occupied large swaths. They occupied all of Belgium, and they occupied much of France. I mean, because that's where the trenches were when the ceasefire came. And even though they held those positions, they surrendered. Now, facts being facts, had the Germans simply let the war go on, it wouldn't have taken long for the Allies, who were newly invigorated by waves and waves of American soldiers, and the German lines, which were more and more populated by old men like me and teenage boys, the lines would have broken. I mean, it just would have broken. But then the Weimar Republic they signed the Treaty of Versailles. And as we know, Treaty of Versailles handed Germany a deal which they had no say in. a deal which labeled Germany as the primary criminals of Europe, which labeled Germany as the ones who caused World War I, and therefore all of the cost associated with World War I had to be borne by Germany. And so they had to accept that treaty or be invaded. All political groups in Germany, all of them, including the Social Democrats, shared a desire to go back and revise or reform the treaty. So the Germans had, okay, we're going to try and take and revise this treaty. We're going to ask the Allies, can we revise the treaty? And of course, the Allies, led by the French, said no. The French thought that the treaty wasn't harsh enough. Because of this, there were varying degrees of loyalty to the Weimar Republic, varying degrees of loyalty. The Weimar Republic was a highly enlightened document in its intention. What is it they say about the path to hell? It is it's lined with good intention. The Weimar Republic was a highly enlightened document in its intention, but of course it had its flaws. For example, it provided for proportional representation for all elections. You say, well, what does that mean? It means that if you were an accredited political party, you would get representation in the parliament. Whether or not, you had enough backers, enough voters to justify such representation. Small parties like the Nazis could work their way into power, which is exactly what happens, by the way. The president of the Weimar Republic both appoints and removes all chancellors. Article 48, here's the big one. Article 48 of the Weimar Republic allowed the president of the Weimar Republic to rule by decree in an emergency. In other words, he could be a dictator in a prescribed emergency. And that permitted temporary presidential dictatorship. And Adolf Hitler will, once he moves to the chancellery, he will do exactly that. Part E. The Weimar Republic did not command the respect or loyalty of many Germans. Many important officials in Germany still favored a constitutional monarchy. I mean, yes, the Hohenzollern Emperor Kaiser Wilhelm II had abdicated and fled to Norway, I believe, maybe Denmark. But, many people wanted to have a monarch back. You and I have never lived under a monarch, so we don't understand this. But there's that sense, particularly in the early part of the 20th century, that, God chose a monarch, and by him being removed, going against the will of God. And so, many professionals had loyally served the Kaiser and hated the Social Democrats. Too liberal. The officers of the army felt that they had been betrayed by the civilians at home because, once again, they surrendered on foreign soil. In March of 1920, a right-wing Kapp-Push, Miss Minning is now circling the word Kapp-Push, or armed insurrection erupted in Berlin. It was a coup, an attempt to overthrow the government. It was led by a civil servant, supported by the army, but eventually the coup failed. But the coup failed only after the government had fled the city and there was a general strike. Later in the month, strikes took place in the Ruhr. The Ruhr, once again, is that industrial region in the western part of Germany. The German government sent troops in to restore order. And in Germany, you have extremism from the right and from the left. Extremism from the conservatives and extremism from basically the communists. Sorry. Extremism from the right and the left would haunt the Republic for all of its days, until it's dead. In May of 1921, the Allies presented a reparations bill to the German government for 132 billion gold marks. 132 billion, today that's And by the way, it's gold marks. They couldn't pay in currency. 132 billion gold marks, which, I mean, Germany is like everybody else. The war devastated their economy. And, so now they got to pay this. The German government accepted this only after the threat of occupation by the Allies. The Allies threatened to come in and occupy the territory. Violence marked the first 5 years of the Weimar Republic as assassination of Republican leaders took place regularly. Also at this time, if we were in class, I would show you, and I'm going to look for it on the internet. I would show you this HBO film that I recorded literally back in the late 80s. It was an HBO documentary. It was called The SS, Hitler's Mad Dream. And I mean, it's really Hollywoodized and glamorized and things of that nature. But actually, most of the stuff, the great majority of the stuff in it is pretty accurate. And so, yeah, I'm going to see if I can find that. I'll post it in Canvas and also try to send it to you via email. It's called The SS, Hitler's Mad Dream. I'll look for it. But I mean, that's the point I was making there. I mean, in the 20s, particularly, and once again, it's the economy, stupid. In the 20s in Germany, there were lots of extremist groups that were forming up and causing lots of violence. And it says there that assassinations of the Weimar Republic officials were not uncommon. Inflation, once again, is the economy, stupid. Inflation brought on the major crisis of the era. Inflation. Now I'm asking Mr. Lin, what is inflation? Inflation, Mr. Lin said, is having too much money, too much currency. There it is. Too much currency in circulation. Which most people have a knee-jerk reaction and they say, oh, inflation is when prices go high. Well, yes, that is true. But prices go high when there's too much money in circulation. And the value of products goes up. Bottom line being, basically what it means is, in an inflationary economy, your currency, the money you have in your pocket, is worth less every day. So, borrowing to finance the war, in order to pay for the war, and the continued post-war deficit spending generated a rise in prices. Now, check out these statistics. Do you have to remember any of them? No. But you need to know the trend. The value of German currency fell to 64 to 1 versus the American dollar. In other words, it would take 64 Deutschmarks to equal an American dollar versus 4.2 Deutschmarks to 1 in 1914. And that's only going to get worse. I will look up and find for you a picture, the very famous picture. It's in your textbook. Yeah, it's in your textbook. Of a bunch of German kids, children. And what they're doing is they have stacks of money. And they're playing with them. They're making a pyramid out of these stacks of money. And this is actual German currency. Fact of the matter is, right about this time in my class, I have in my desk a 100,000 Weimar Republic Reichsnote. 100,000 Deutschmarks. Now, how did I come across this? Well, actually, I got it from the grandfather of my first wife, who was in Germany. But I mean, those things were floating around like, they were using them to wallpaper the walls by that time because they were practically worthless. And so, yeah, inflation just went rampant. It literally would. You would have to take currency in a wheelbarrow down to the bakery to get a loaf of bread. That's not an exaggeration of any way, shape, or form. So the French invaded the Ruhr for the purposes of collecting taxes. I believe one of your collecting revenues. They invaded the Ruhr because the Ruhr was the most productive industrial portion of Germany. They invaded the Ruhr, the western region of Germany. That sent prices spiraling. There was a strike in the Ruhr, so there was a reduction of productivity and a drain on tax revenues for the Treasury. By November of 1923, now here's a stat. Do you have to remember it? No, but it shows you the direction. One American dollar, which had been worth 64 to 1 versus the Deutschmark, was now worth more than 800 million Deutschmarks. Stores, it says there, would simply not accept the currency, and farmers withheld their produce. And so what starts happening is, the currency is worthless, people have no trust in it, and, to really get something at the market, you basically have to resort to barter, trading items. So anyway, the results of this rapid inflation were staggering. Middle class savings. I mean, in an inflationary economy, in the 1970s, the big problem was inflation in this country. And I say big problem. It really began to be felt a lot during the one-term presidency of Jimmy Carter. And, Jimmy Carter, President Carter, who's still alive, he's, everybody, when they mention Jimmy Carter's name, they talk about, in glowing terms, and I believe so too. I think probably one of the most moral and also intelligent people ever to occupy the Oval Office was Jimmy Carter. From Georgia, peanut farmer, a United States naval officer. He was the commander of a nuclear submarine, which meant he majored in nuclear physics at the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis. He was really intelligent. Problem with being so intelligent. See, intelligence doesn't always translate into effectiveness, because intelligence can be a weakness. For example, if you allow that intelligence to take over, it handicaps you. You say, what does that mean? What are you talking about, Mr. Warren? Well, because you have to make a decision. As a president, your most important job is to make decisions. And as a president, any decision that reaches your desk is not an easy decision. The president makes no easy decision. He makes all of his decisions are very difficult decisions. And, Jimmy Carter became the president. And when he became president, the economy was already in mild inflation. By the time Jimmy Carter left the presidency, inflation in this country was approaching 20% per year. And you say, well, okay, what does that mean? Well, it means this. In an inflationary economy like that, there's no point in saving money. No point at all. Because if you save money next year, if you take that same money that you're saving and go out and try to buy something, then you will not be able to buy as much next year as you could this year. And so saving money is out of the question. And you have to remember, where do banks get their money? Banks get their money from savings accounts. And if nobody's saving their money, then, it then costs more money to loan money. What is called the prime interest rate increases, and therefore the businesses who operate on loan money, they have difficulty borrowing money, and it puts a drain on the economy. So rapid inflation were staggering. Middle class savings, pensions became worthless because a pension is a fixed income. It doesn't increase as fast as the rate of inflation. Insurance policies are wiped out, as were investments in government bonds. And yeah, debts and mortgages could be easily paid off. Speculators in land, real estate, and industry made great fortunes. Farmers did well because they were, everybody needs food, as we're finding out now. And but farmers didn't trade for currency, they traded for barter. However, to the middle and lower classes, this was a catastrophe. Coming on the heels of war, the treaty, and these people wanted to restore order at practically any cost, which leads us to this. On my board, I would write the following words: that in times of emergency, people will always trade liberty for security. Say again, in times of emergency, people will always trade liberty for security. In other words, one of the strengths that authoritarian governments have that democracies do not have is authoritarian governments can make a decision and say, we're going to do this. As you saw on Capitol Hill when they debated the checks to be sent out, the money to be sent out, the relief package to be sent out for this country, everybody said, yes, there needs to be a relief package, but they couldn't reach an agreement on how much the package was, who would be included. I mean, it took forever. There was the one congressman from northern Kentucky who, when they were getting ready to pass the bill, said, no, we can't pass it by remote vote. I want everybody to be there. Be there in Washington. Come all the way from Wyoming or wherever. At great personal risk. Yeah. But yeah, a congressman. Point of the matter is, the Congress of the United States is a ginormous committee of 535 guys. And I mean, come on. You can't get 3 people to agree upon where to go to dinner. But 535 guys, how are you going to get them to agree upon which direction to go? Oh, something like this. Whereas a dictator. And so, yeah. And what that saying further means that people will always trade liberty away for security. So that means they will trade away things like freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom to assemble peaceably. They'll trade those things away. They will trade away rights like, an individual's right if they're accused of a crime. That is why, and we're talking about Hitler now, that is why when Adolf Hitler takes over and suddenly in the middle of the night, people would hear, the dogs start barking outside, a truck roll up, and then a bunch of boots get out and maybe some shouting. And the next day, the Jewish family next door were gone. They will simply say nothing, maybe because they're anti-Semitic, or maybe they're happy that they have a job. Because, we're going to learn about Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler did some serious miracle working in Germany with putting that country back on its feet economically. And once again, when Hitler would go to those rallies, I mean, people would come out to see him. Those people weren't forced to be there. I mean, they wanted to be there. They supported him wholeheartedly because he did make changes. He did bring about changes that pumped up the economy. He told people exactly what they wanted to hear. This situation you're in, Germany, is not your fault. You were betrayed by politicians, by Jews, by the defeatists, by et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And he starts pointing fingers. And that people like that message. Why? Because it's not my fault anymore. It's not my fault. It's somebody else's fault. He's right. And oh yeah, the jobs are coming back. Anyway, Roman numeral 28. Let's talk about that guy. Adolf Hitler. The most notorious figure of the 20th century was and is Adolf Hitler. Yeah, I mean, you just say the word, nobody, if I were to ask, who is Mao Zedong? Most people would maybe know, maybe not know. Leave me alone. Most people would know, maybe not know. Joseph Stalin, perhaps a few more would know about them. These are two of the great murderers of the 20th century. Lots and lots and lots of people, millions of people died in China and the Soviet Union under the directives of these two guys. You don't hear about them. Adolf Hitler, though, you hear about. Why? Because Adolf Hitler pushed forward a war that will, in the end, consume 70 million people. 70 million people. Most countries in the world today do not have 70 million people. And so, 70 million people. From the view of this, for example, in the Soviet Union, which I just mentioned, in World War II, 1 out of 7. 1 out of 7, that's like 13% of the population, die in World War II. And and they point all that to Adolf Hitler. All right, so Hitler had a rather wandering youth. He was the son of an Austrian paper hanger, the man who he hung wallpaper for a living. In Vienna, he had become acquainted with the Christian Social Party, which had anti-Semitic leanings. You may or may not recall, he was a veteran of World War I. He was wounded in a gas attack in World War I. Once again, he became acquainted with the Christian Social Party, which had anti-Semitic leanings. That goes far back in his youth. And I've heard people say that Hitler was Jewish and all this kind of business. I've never seen any real documentation on that. I do know he was anti-Semitic, and anti-Semitism was a thing that, was very, very common in all of Europe during this time. So, in 1920, he became associated with the National Social German Workers' Party, also called the NDSAP, which will eventually evolve into the Naziozze, or the Nazi Party. The party issued a platform known as the 25 Points. And I saw you, Miss Minnie, you just circled that because see, I wrote it in italics. That's a good circle. The 25 Points, which called for repudiation of the Versailles Treaty. In other words, get rid of the Versailles Treaty, and you can understand that. Unification of Austria and Germany into one country. Yes. The exclusion of Jews from German citizenship. Agrarian reform, meaning reforming the way that farming, land ownership was done. Prohibition of land speculation. Land speculation is when you buy land specifically so that the cost of that land will increase, and then you turn around and sell the land. That's land speculation. Confiscation of war profits. State administration of the giant cartels, meaning the big businesses. and replacement of large department stores with small retail shops. The Nazis redefined the word socialism to reflect a nationalist outlook. I mean, the big thing about the fascists, and remember that Nazism is a form of fascism. Say again, Nazism is a form of fascism. In Italy, they just call the fascists, but in Germany, they're fascist as well, but they're a particular brand of fascists. They are the Nazis. And a primary shaker of fascism is extreme nationalism. Extreme nationalism. One of the things I love watching documentaries. One of the reasons I learned this was that in 1923 Hitler wrote his book Mein Kampf, and talks about this and this and this. Talks about his plan going forward. But in 1928 he wrote another book that never got published, but that they discovered. And in this book, it talks further about his plan. And he delineates his plan for, yes, not just the conquest of Europe, but once Europe is conquered, you see, at the core of the Nazi Party's idealism is the elevation of the German, the Aryan race. And that idea that this supreme race should dominate the entire world. And it goes and talks about how after Europe is under control of the Nazis, that next would be North America. Incredible. Yeah. So anyway, the socialism that Hitler defined was not state ownership of the means of production, but the subordination of all economic enterprise to the welfare of the nation. Okay, what does that mean? Basically, it means that his Nazi state would be under continual wartime footing. You say, well, what does that mean? Well, it means that all businesses, you can own your business. It's yours to own. It's yours to manage and yours to keep your profits from whatever. But we're going to tell you what to produce. And you're going to produce the things that we say that the country needs. Not state ownership of the means of production, but all of economic enterprise was directed by the state. The party appealed to virtually any economic group that was experiencing the pressure and instability of the World War I. They found support amongst the war veterans. Yes. Now, in the early days of the Nazi Party, there was this one group that you won't need to know, and yeah, they're on your test. They were called the Brown Shirts. The Brown Shirts were kind of like a lot of paramilitarist groups that we have in the United States today. They packed lots of guns. They had a very nationalistic ideology, and they were a bunch of thugs in the story. And they were led by this guy. His name was Ernst Röhm. And so Hitler, the Nazi Party, the fledgling Nazi Party, and the Brown Shirts joined together because they had common cause. However, as time went on, these Brown Shirt guys were such thugs that the legitimate power structure of Germany, the legitimate businesses, were put off by the Brown Shirts because they were so violent. And it's called, as Mr. Foat can tell you, it's called the Night of the Long Knives, in a 3-day span. And see, dictators have, they have so many traits in common. And one of the traits that dictators have in common is to rid themselves of potential political opposition. And in this Night of the Long Knives, and I think the year is 1925, Hitler has Heinrich Himmler and a lot of his other cronies to go out and assassinate all of the members of the brown shirt leadership, including, they murdered them, Ernst Ruhr and the brown shirt leadership. I mean, you know, they wanted to keep, pardon me, they wanted to keep the thugs, they wanted to keep the bodies, but they just didn't, you know, they wanted to assume the leadership of the brown shirts, because the brown shirts were kind of, you know, they were kind of, they're hard to deal with, and so they brought them under control. And so the so-called SA, this literally translates into Sturmabteilung, which is in your terms, or stormtroopers that were called, were organized on the leadership of Ernst Ruhr and the brown shirts. The SA, when it says were the chief instrument of Nazi intimidation. Why don't we pick up there with F tomorrow, okay? I'll put this at the very top right there. And so, yeah, we are going to finish this test. We're going to have this test on Friday. I'm working on about 2/3 of the way done with it. And, you know, I'll be glad when this is over. And by this, I mean, you know, this whole, can you imagine, did you envision this? I never envisioned this. Although, you know, and I used to say, you know, one day there'll be this time when this virus comes along that gets spread by air. And, you know, I just thought it would happen after I was gone. And, you know, here it is. Should that frighten you? Well, I mean, no, but it just makes you, should make you aware. You know, and do the things you need to. Let's get through this. And let's go back to being bored in Mr. Horton's class again, as opposed to watching him on a screen. Because he misses you. He misses his old life. So yeah, have a good day, guys. I will be back tomorrow.